The order came before sunrise, carried on a voice so calm it sounded like weather, not command. "Remove your clothes." For a second, no one moved. The sky above Manila's port was still grey, the tide lapping against rusted hulls. Diesel fumes mixed with salt and sweat, and on the pier, 300 Japanese women, nurses, clerks, volunteers, civilians, stood in a line that felt endless. Their uniforms were stiff with dried mud, sleeves torn, hems crusted with blood. For days they had marched barefoot through a landscape of surrender, herded between burnt trucks and broken statues. Now, at the water's edge, silence. A British officer's boots scraped against the gravel. He didn't shout. He simply repeated, "Remove your clothes." The words cut deeper than any weapon. The women froze, eyes darting to the bayonets, glinting behind the guards. They had heard the stories that Allied troops showed no mercy to Japanese prisoners, especially women. Rumors had crawled across islands like fire. Torture, humiliation, revenge. Some had already whispered prayers under their breath. Others simply closed their eyes, waiting for the end. Eiko Sato, a former army nurse, was near the middle of the line. Her heartbeat pulsed so loud she could barely hear the surf. This was it, she thought. This was how history erased people not with bullets, but with orders. But then something strange happened. Behind the row of guards, men in medical coats appeared. White sheets, not ropes, hung over their arms. A tall British sergeant, young but with eyes too old for his face, stepped forward and spoke softly, as if the air itself might break. "You will be inspected for lice and infection. Medical procedure. No harm will come to you." No harm. The phrase landed like an insult. The women stared at him, motionless, their fear sharpening into disbelief. The soldiers waited. No jeering, no violence. Just the low hum of the tide and the smell of disinfectant mixing with sea salt. It was Eiko who finally stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she unbuttoned her tunic. She did not look up. One by one, the others followed. Shame burned hotter than fear. But when the first towel touched her shoulders, something cracked in her chest. The fabric was clean, warm, smelling faintly of soap. The medic who handed it to her looked away, face tight with discomfort. He wasn't gloating. He was embarrassed. That flicker of decency, small, human, unspoken, hit harder than any cruelty could have. For the first time since capture, Eiko's body stopped shaking, not from safety, from confusion. Around her, guards avoided eye contact, backs turned. The women, half wrapped in towels, looked at one another as if seeing ghosts. The inspection was silent. No laughter, no cruelty, only a strange professionalism that felt almost holy in its restraint. When it ended, the sergeant spoke again. "Proceed to medical tents for further checks." The women stood motionless, towels clutched to their chests, still unsure if this mercy was a trick. Eiko turned once toward the sea, the dawn light now spilling across the port, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw the shape of something she hadn't seen since childhood. Not victory. Not. Just humanity, flickering like sunlight on water. Inside the canvas tents, the air hung heavy with iodine, damp cloth, and something else restraint. Lanterns swung from ropes, throwing long, slow shadows across khaki walls that fluttered with each breath of wind. The noise of Manila's harbour pulsed faintly beyond the flaps' diesel engines, distant trucks, waves that refused to stop, reminding them there was still a world outside. The women stepped in barefoot, clutching their towels as if they were armour. Their skin prickled from the change heat outside, cool shade within. A dozen allied medics moved quietly around tables lined with gauze, basins and soap bars wrapped in brown paper. No shouting, no mockery, just the careful rhythm of men, doing a job they didn't want to think too hard about. Akko felt her stomach tighten as a voice called out, "Next." The British sergeant from the David Wallace stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. His eyes flicked from name to name, never once lifting to meet the faces that passed. It wasn't cruelty. It was something colder discipline laced with shame. When Akko's turn came, she stepped forward. The floor felt rough against her feet. "Name?" Wallace asked quietly. She hesitated. "Sato. Akko." He nodded once, writing quickly. The pen scratched softly, almost respectfully. Then came the motions: pulse check, temperature, quick glance at bruises, inspection for wounds or infection. The nurse beside Himan, older woman, in a spotless white coat, spoke softly to Akko, pointing toward a wash basin. The tone was clinical, professional, yet every gesture seemed to carry a kind of apology too deep to voice. Akko's hands shook as she reached for the basin. The water was warm. Soap floated on its surface, a thin swirl of bubbles glistening in the lantern light. For the first time in months, she saw her reflection, a pale, hollow face staring back, hair matted, lips cracked. The sight startled her more than the soldiers had. She looked like a ghost, trying to remember being alive. Behind her, another woman sobbed quietly. Not from pain, something else. Relief, maybe. The sound startled one of the British nurses, who turned quickly, whispering something in English Akko didn't understand. Wallace paused his writing but didn't interfere. He simply said, "Let them finish in peace." Those words, soft, low, almost swallowed by the wind, did not belong to war. Minutes passed in fragile silence. The nurses cleaned wounds. Hands bandaged scrapes. Bottles of disinfectant clicked open and shut. Even the guards at the tent door stood still, helmets tilted down, pretending not to see. When the inspection ended, Akko found herself sitting on a wooden crate near the flap. A young soldier offered her a tin cup of water. She hesitated, then took it. The cup was dented, the water metallic, but it was cold. It felt undeserved. Through the tent's opening, she saw the same sea that had once carried supply ships to the Empire and now brought aid for its captives. The irony hit like a blow. Wallace stepped outside, speaking quietly with another officer. His voice was tired, almost human. He rubbed the back of his neck, gaze fixed somewhere far away, as though mercy itself weighed heavier than cruelty. Akko pulled the towel tighter. The smell of iodine lingered on her skin, sharp and clean, erasing the stench of jungle, fear, and surrender. When the order came to move to the sleeping quarters, the women obeyed without question. As they filed out, Akko looked once more at Wallace. He didn't look up, but his hand twitched, as if resisting the urge to salute a kind of courage he wasn't supposed to recognize. Outside, the sunlight was blinding again, and for the first time, Akko realized how quiet survival could sound. By morning, the camp smelled of something unthinkable: food, not gun oil, not smoke, not rot, but broth. Steam curled from tin pots balanced over open fires, drifting between rows of tents and coiling around barbed wire like mist. The prisoners stood, watching as British and Australian orderlies moved among them, carrying ladles, bowls, and the clatter of metal spoons. Akko blinked against the rising sun, eyes still swollen from sleeplessness. Her stomach twisted at the smell. Onions, meat, something faintly sweet. It felt wrong, almost cruel, that an enemy could make hunger smell holy. The guards called them forward, row by row. Form line, step up, bowl. The Japanese women hesitated, exchanging glances heavy with disbelief. For months, food had meant survival by theft, scraps hidden, meals fought over, water rationed to the sip. Now the same hands that captured them were handing them soup. Aiko watched as the first woman stepped forward. The soldier behind the pot, young, freckles hidden under soot, ladled the brownish liquid into her bowl, nodded once, and gestured for her to move along. No laughter, no jeer, just the clink of metal and the steam between them. Aiko waited until the woman tasted it. A pause, then another sip. No collapse, no poison. The air shifted. She stepped forward next. The soldier filled her bowl and hesitated, as if searching for the right thing to say. He pointed at the red cross, painted on a nearby crate. "Rules," he murmured. "Not kindness, rules." She didn't understand all the words, but the tone carried something steady, the sound of duty, pretending not to be mercy. The broth was warm, salty, and thick enough to coat her tongue. Aiko's throat clenched. For months, she had tasted only mud, rainwater, and fear. Now warmth ran through her chest like electricity. She swallowed, and something inside her cracked. Around her, the others began to eat too slow, careful, reverent. A few wept without meaning to, silent tears running into their bowls. Others whispered to each other, unsure how to speak gratitude in a war where words like that didn't exist. One nurse muttered, "They feed us better than our officers did." The soldier nearby didn't react. He probably didn't understand. But the line lingered in the air like confession. The camp's noise softened into a rhythm spoon tapping metal, breaths released, the sound of men and women chewing in uneasy peace. Aiko looked down into her empty bowl. The surface gleamed back at her like a mirror. Her reflection seemed older, her eyes hollow but awake. For the first time since her capture, she didn't think of death. She thought of tomorrow. When the bowls were collected, the same soldier came around again, offering refills. She shook her head, but he ladled another scoop anyway, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been a smile. Her control slipped. "Why?" She whispered, not sure if she meant him, the war, or herself. He didn't answer, just tapped the red cross again, then moved on. Aiko sat quietly, the taste of broth lingering like an after-image. She didn't want to call it kindness, but she couldn't call it anything else. By the third day, the camp had found its rhythm, a strange, quiet machine of mercy. Wake up, line up, eat, wash, wait. But routine didn't make sense to minds built for fear. The barbed wire still glinted under the Philippine sun. The rifles still followed every movement, and yet the cruelty never came. Aiko sat with her back against a tent pole, listening to the guards' voices outside, casual, bored, even joking. It made her uneasy. Enemy voices were supposed to sound like thunder, not laughter. Near the fence, a group of Australian soldiers were smoking. The smell drifted toward the women, sharp, bitter, human. One of the men, a corporal with sunburned arms and tired eyes, noticed the women watching. He flicked his lighter open and gestured toward them through the wire. "Smoke?" The word was rough, but his tone wasn't. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Suspicion was muscle deep now. Anything that looked like kindness felt like bait. But one of the younger women, her nerves long since frayed, stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she took the cigarette he offered. The flame from his lighter trembled too. She inhaled, coughed violently, then laughed, a dry, broken sound that startled everyone. including herself. Laughter in a prison camp felt obscene, yet within seconds, others joined her. Small, awkward chuckles that spread through the group like the first breath after drowning. Echo watched from the edge, her chest tightening. The moment was absurd, soldiers and prisoners sharing silence and smoke between wire. War had rules for everything except this. The corporal looked at her, then at his dwindling pack. He offered one without a word. She took it, unsure. Why? Maybe to understand. Maybe just to stop shaking. When she exhaled, the smoke burned and tears pricked her eyes. It wasn't the cigarette. It was the realization that she'd forgotten what peace felt like. Behind her, the same British Sergeant Wallace watched from a distance, his expression unreadable, but his posture said what words couldn't. Be careful. Mercy has consequences. Later that evening, Akko was summoned to assist in the infirmary. She hesitated before entering, expecting interrogation. But instead, she found boxes stamped Commonwealth Medical Corps stacked neatly along the wall. Gauze, quinine, morphine abundance she hadn't seen since before the Empire began to starve. She ran her fingers across a roll of fresh bandages, whispering, "They have too much to lose." A nurse beside her, hearing but not understanding, smiled politely. They worked in silence. When Akko finished her shift, the same Australian corporal was waiting by the door. He held out another cigarette. She shook her head this time. "Why?" she asked in halting English. He shrugged. "Because you look like you need one." She didn't smoke. She didn't thank him either. She just stood there as he walked away, leaving a trail of grey in the humid air. That night, lying under the thin wool blanket, Akko pulled a scrap of ration paper from her sleeve. With a dull pencil, she wrote a single line. The enemy's hands shake too. She folded it carefully into the lining of her blanket, a secret thought too fragile to survive daylight. Outside, a generator coughed to life, drowning the night in a low mechanical hum. And somewhere near the fence, the glow of a single cigarette burned like a star that refused to die. The note Akko wrote didn't survive the morning. At dawn, the guards stormed in boots, orders, cold efficiency. Every scrap of paper was seized. Blankets unfolded. Lockers overturned. The British were polite even in intrusion, but their politeness didn't soften the loss. When they left, the women sat in silence among the scattered straw, clutching what little remained. Akko's blanket felt lighter. Her note was gone. By afternoon, a corporal read the new order aloud in clipped English, voice echoing through the campyard. No personal correspondence, all written material, subject to inspection by command. An interpreter translated it line by line, his tone flat and careful. The women lowered their heads, not out of obedience, out of exhaustion. For many of them, words were the only places left to hide. Akko stared at her empty hands, feeling foolish for mourning a sentence that barely existed. But words had weight when everything else had been stripped away. That night, under the faint glow of a lantern, she began again, not on paper this time, but on the back of a discarded medical label. Her handwriting trembled, but she wrote slowly, deliberately. "To whoever finds this, I was told, surrender erases honor. But here, I see men who show more honor than those who taught me." Her breath caught as she wrote it. The words didn't feel like rebellion, they felt like confession. Soon, others began to do the same. Scraps of ration wrappers, bandage tags, cigarette cartons, anything that could hold ink. The letters weren't messages home. They were whispers to ghosts, apologies to the dead, and fragments of thought too fragile for voice. Some wrote of the soup. Some wrote of the towels. Some simply wrote, Names, husbands, brothers, children, followed by the word alive. Historians would one day find hundreds of these notes hidden across camps from the Philippines to New Guinea. They called them the mercy letters. But for the women who wrote them, they were something simpler, a way to prove they still existed. One evening, as Ako folded her letter and slipped it under her blanket, a shadow crossed the doorway. Sergeant Wallace. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just said, "You shouldn't risk this." His voice was low, tired, threaded with something she couldn't name. Pity. Maybe. Or guilt. She met his eyes for the first time. "Why do you care?" she asked softly, the English words heavy and uneven on her tongue. He hesitated, then took the paper gently from her hands. For a moment, he looked as though he might tear it apart, but he didn't. He folded it once, twice, and slid it into his pocket. "Some things shouldn't be destroyed," he said quietly. He turned and left. Days passed. Rumors spread that certain guards were keeping the prisoners' letters, hiding them instead of burning them, not as intelligence, not as trophies, but because they couldn't throw them away. Words, it seemed, were harder to destroy than enemies. Ako never saw her letter again, but weeks later, she noticed Wallace carried something folded in his breast pocket, always pressed close to his heart. She didn't ask if it was hers. She didn't need to. That letter, sealed in silence, had already chosen its place. Not in the fire, but in memory. By late summer, mercy had become dangerous. The same men who once handed out soup now whispered behind closed doors. Laughter faded from the barracks. Cigarettes vanished from the fence line. Even the rhythm of footsteps changed shorter, sharper, like the ground itself had lost its trust. It began, as all poison does, with rumor. "He's gone soft," one guard murmured in the mess hall. "He talks to them," said another, "reads their letters, thinks they're people." The words spread faster than heat. By the third retelling, Sergeant Wallace wasn't just sympathetic, he was compromised. A British guard who felt pity for the enemy. A soldier infected with humanity. In war, that was treason. Wallace kept to his post, face calm, voice even. But his eyes betrayed fatigue, the kind that came from holding back too much. Every night he sat on the edge of his cot, running his thumb over the crease in the paper he still carried in his breast pocket. He told himself it was for evidence. He knew it wasn't. Outside, the camp followed its routines, but the air felt heavier. Guards spoke less. Orders came down from above, with precision sharp enough to cut through thought. Maintain discipline, no personal communication, professional distance at all times. The kind of phrases that pretended to keep men safe from their own hearts. Ako noticed the change too. The soldiers no longer looked through her, they looked past her. No more nods, no more fleeting moments of contact. The small world of civility they'd built was shrinking, and in its place came something colder fear of the wrong kind of decency. During laundry duty, Ako overheard 2 Australian privates near the supply shed. "You really think those women are just nurses?" one asked. The other shrugged. "Spies. More like they know codes. Radio ops. Half of them probably trained." "Maybe," said the first. "But they're beaten now." "Doesn't matter," the other replied. "Beaten dogs still bite." Their voices were low, but not low enough. Ako caught every word. She didn't flinch. She'd learned silence was the only armor that didn't break. That night, Wallace found a note on his cot. Not from her. Not signed. Just 3 words scrawled in pencil. "Watch your back." He didn't need to ask who sent it. Mercy had made him visible. Military reports would later call it sentimental fatigue, a quiet sickness that spread among guards who spent too long near prisoners. It wasn't infection. It was empathy. And in war, empathy was a liability. Aiko could feel it too, the shift in temperature, the closing in. Each day, the guard's eyes grew harder. The laughter stopped completely. When the soup came, it came cold. Yet through all of it, Wallace kept his distance and his promise. He didn't destroy the letter. He didn't look away when she passed. But he didn't speak again either. Their truce had become a prive, silence the only kind of mercy left that could survive command. The order arrived just before dawn, typed in black ink, stamped with a seal that smelled of ink and authority. The kind of paper that ended people quietly. 51 names, no reasons, no explanations. Echoes was the 12th. When Wallace saw it, something inside him went still. Transfers weren't unusual camps, traded prisoners often between American and British control. But the names on this list weren't random. They were the ones who had spoken too freely, written too often, or simply been noticed too much. And Akko had been all three. The trucks lined up under the floodlights, engines idling in the thick Manila heat, diesel fumes mixed with morning fog until the whole yard looked like it was breathing. Prisoners stood in neat rows, faces blank, burlap sacks clutched against their chests. The war had taught them that silence was safer than dignity. Wallace moved along the line with a clipboard, checking numbers, counting heads, pretending his hands weren't shaking. His uniform collar stuck to the back of his neck with sweat. He could feel eyes watching him, officers, guards, suspicion itself. Aiko stood near the middle. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes, those he could never mistake, were calm in a way that terrified him. When her number was called, she stepped forward, climbed onto the truck, and turned for a heartbeat. The noise of engines faded, and time folded into itself. She lifted her hand, not in surrender, not in pleading, but in salute. It wasn't the stiff, nationalistic gesture she had once given to portraits of emperors. It was small, personal, a recognition. Wallace's throat tightened. He returned the gesture barely, subtly, a fraction of movement that could be mistaken for a scratch on his chin. But she saw it. Dust rose behind the tires as the trucks began to move. Chains clanked, not restraints, just tailgates closing. The convoy rumbled out through the gate, sunlight catching the barbed wire one last time. He stood motionless long after they were gone. The lieutenant approached. "Routine transfer," he said, lighting a cigarette. "Don't dwell." Wallace didn't reply. He watched the smoke drift upward, wondering if the lieutenant could smell the lie beneath his own words. He knew where the convoy was headed south, toward the American sector near Batangas. He also knew what routine meant now. It meant disappearance with paperwork, erasure with a rubber stamp. In his breast pocket, the folded letter felt heavier than any weapon. Later reports would record the transfer as successful, all prisoners delivered without incident. No one mentioned the salute. No one mentioned the silence. No one mentioned the look that passed between a guard and a nurse in the moment before the trucks rolled away. War doesn't keep records of mercy. Wallace stood by the gate until the engines were nothing but ghosts in the fog. Then he did what soldiers do. When conscience collides with duty, he memorized her absence and called it order. The American camp didn't smell like war. It smelled like bleach and paperwork. When the convoy rolled through the gates, Aiko's first impression was the silence. No shouting, no chaos, no smoke. Just order, whitewashed barracks standing in perfect rows, flags snapping in the wind, the dull hum of machinery somewhere behind the walls. The guards wore clean uniforms and unreadable expressions. Their boots struck the asphalt in identical rhythm, every movement measured. It wasn't cruelty. It was efficiency. Numbers typed onto tags. Tags stapled to files. At Camp Batangas, humanity had been organized into neat columns of data. A sergeant with a clipboard called names in a flat Midwestern accent, his voice precise, devoid of emotion. Each woman stepped forward, was assigned a bunk, a ration card, a daily schedule. It all happened so quickly that it felt less like captivity and more like conversion the body translated into protocol. The British had treated them like souls. The Americans treated them like statistics. Meals were punctual, 7 breakfast, 12 inspection, 18 lights out, no exceptions, no deviations. The food was clean but cold, canned beans, bread, coffee that tasted of rust. Eiko chewed mechanically, staring at the neat handwriting on her ration slip. P421, Sato, A. She wasn't a nurse anymore. She wasn't even Eiko. She was a line item in a system that valued precision more than pity. And yet, in its own way, this order was terrifyingly humane. There was no mockery, no pain, no rage, only absence. The guards didn't leer the way she had feared. They didn't even look. They spoke less than the British had, smiled less, hesitated less. Their mercy was procedural. Their indifference was perfect. That night, Ako lay awake in her bunk, listening to the ocean beyond the perimeter. She could smell salt through the iron slats of the window. She could see the moon through barbed wire. Freedom wasn't far, just invisible. When the siren blew for curfew, a young guard walked the aisle between bunks, checking tags, faces, blankets. He stopped near Eiko's bed for only a second, muttered something she couldn't catch, then moved on. The inspection was so precise it felt like a machine breathing. Days passed, like carbon copies. Work, meals, silence, every motion regulated, every kindness timed. The only color in the camp came from the Red Cross emblem painted on the side of the infirmary, a crimson reminder that compassion had been standardized. Eiko found herself longing for the chaos of Manila, the rough hands, the awkward smiles, the accidental warmth. Here, everything functioned too perfectly to feel alive. During evening roll call, she noticed the difference most clearly. The British had looked away when the women undressed for inspection. The Americans didn't look away. They didn't look at all. It was as if they had been trained not to see. One night, under a flickering bulb, Ako whispered to the woman in the next bunk, "The British made me feel human. These men make me feel invisible." The woman turned toward her, eyes open in the dark. "Maybe," she said softly. "That's what safety is when no one dares to see you." Ako didn't answer. Outside, the waves crashed against the distant shore, steady and cold. And in the space between the sound and the silence, she realized something quietly devastating. Mercy and indifference could look almost the same. It happened at noon. No warning, no gunfire. Just a crackle through a loudspeaker mounted on a jeep parked near the mess hall. The air was thick with humidity. Even the flies seemed to move slower. Prisoners were eating their rations, canned beans, coffee that still tasted of rust when the static broke. Then came a voice, thin, metallic, unsure. "Japan has accepted the terms of unconditional surrender." For a long time, no one moved. The words hung in the heat, like smoke that refused to fade. Then, slowly, bowls stopped clattering. Hands froze mid-motion. One woman's spoon fell and rolled across the dirt. The sound impossibly loud. Aiko's breath hitched. She had dreamed of this moment and feared it in equal measure, imagined flames, vengeance, collapse. But this, a sentence delivered through static? Around her, silence spread like water soaking into dry earth. No cheering, no screaming, just stillness. The American guards didn't celebrate. They simply removed their helmets and stood in quiet formation. Even they seemed to understand that what had ended wasn't victory. It was an era of believing hate was useful. Aiko stared at the ground. Her hands trembled. All her life, she'd been taught that surrender was shame, that defeat was worse than death. But in this stillness, shame felt irrelevant. The war outside had stopped, yet the war inside her would take longer to die. A few women began to cry, soft, polite sobs that sounded almost rehearsed. Others whispered prayers they hadn't dared say in months. But Aiko didn't cry. She simply knelt, letting the hot dust cling to her knees, feeling the weight of the air pressing down. Across the yard, an American officer lowered the camp flag to half-mast for the dead. For everyone. Even for the enemy. The act struck something deep inside her chest, a gesture of respect where she'd expected triumph. She wanted to hate him for it, but couldn't. Somewhere among the static, faint music began to play the broadcast of the Emperor's voice, relayed through distant stations. The sound warped, fading in and out, but the tone carried regret, finality, survival. Aiko closed her eyes. The sun burned against her eyelids. She thought of the towel, the broth, the cigarette through the wire. She thought of Wallace and the letter he hadn't burned. All the small mercies that had felt like betrayals of what she'd been taught. And for the first time, she understood. War ends with silence, not with sound. The guards resumed their posts. The prisoners resumed breathing. But the world, as they'd known it, had cracked down the middle. Aiko whispered one sentence. To no one in particular. If surrender is survival, then we've all surrendered long ago. The ocean wind picked up, carrying the smell of salt and rust and something else, relief. Maybe. The loudspeaker hissed one last time, then died. No trumpets, no applause, just quiet. The ocean was glass when the ship left Manila Bay. Rows of Japanese women stood along the deck railings, khaki coats fluttering in the warm wind, watching the city fade into mist. The war was over. Yet its taste still lingered in the air salt, rust, and memory. Aiko leaned against the railing, a small canvas bag at her feet. Inside, one change of clothes, a toothbrush, and silence. Freedom had been returned to her, but it didn't feel like homecoming. It felt like displacement wearing mercy's mask. For days, the ship cut across still waters, tracing invisible lines over battlefields now sunk beneath the waves. Each sunrise painted the deck in silver. Each evening, the women gathered wordlessly, their faces turned toward a Japan they could no longer imagine. The guards on board treated them well enough, polite, distant, no cruelty, no comfort. It was as if everyone feared that a single word might break the thin peace that held the world together. Aiko thought often of Wallace, the sergeant with kind eyes who had carried her letter against orders. She wondered if he had survived, if conscience had cost him more than rank. When Japan's coastline finally appeared, grey through the mist, no one cheered. Some cried. Others stared. The docks were crowded with officials, doctors, and silence. Tokyo was a skeleton city, roofs peeled back, streets reduced to ash and stone. Even the wind smelled of surrender. As Akko stepped off the ship, a child offered her a rice ball through the fence, half cracked, still warm. She bowed, tears burning her eyes. Kindness again, arriving where she least expected it. That night, in a repatriation dormitory lit by weak bulbs, she unpacked her bag. At the bottom, hidden beneath the folded clothes, she found the letter, the one she thought had been taken. Folded, yellowed, still breathing ink. She traced the creases with her fingers. The paper felt fragile, like a piece of skin. "To whoever finds this," it began, "I believed honor was in dying well, but perhaps honor is in learning to live." She never mailed it. She folded it again, tucked it into the lining of an old coat, and carried it through the decades that followed, through hunger, rebuilding, motherhood, and the quiet peace that feels like waiting. Time moved on. Occupation ended. The cities rebuilt. Generations forgot the language of loss. Then, 70 years later, in 2019, her granddaughter donated that same coat to a small history museum in Canberra. The archivist nearly missed it. The paper was wedged deep in the seam, fragile as ash. When he unfolded it, the handwriting was graceful, still legible. The ink had bled, but the words had survived. "To the man who showed me mercy when war forgot how." No surname, just Akko. Curators traced the details and found his name in the archives. Sergeant David Wallace, Royal Army Medical Corps. He had survived 1,945. Among his belongings, donated years later by his son, was a folded paper written in Japanese, translated by hand, on the back in pencil. It was her letter. He had carried it home. The two documents were reunited in the exhibit under a single glass case. No uniforms, no medals, just handwriting and silence. The plaque beneath read, "It was not victory that ended their hatred. It was decency." Visitors often paused there, some weeping quietly, others simply staring not at the words, but at what they represented. That in all the machinery of war, the human heart had survived. Rain tapped gently against the museum windows. Akko's granddaughter stood before the glass, eyes bright with reflection. Outside, the storm moved on, leaving only the soft echo of mercy, steady, persistent, eternal. And in that silence, history finally exhaled.